You know that highly specific but vague sense of exhaustion you might be feeling
Oh,
lately?
yeah, like a sort of distinct, almost atmospheric pressure.
Exactly. Because I was looking at the major economic indices yesterday, and, on paper, everything looks quite robust. The stock market is up, GDP is technically growing.
Right. And the store shelves are mostly full.
Yeah, the shelves in my neighborhood are totally fine. And yet, talking to people, the everyday experience of just, well, living feels inexplicably heavier. Operating daily life seems to demand way more baseline energy than it did even a couple of years ago.
It really does. We often look for a single catastrophic crisis to explain why we feel so drained. Like a big event.
Right? A glaring daily emergency.
Exactly. But when there isn't one, we tend to internalize that friction. We assume, oh, I'm just managing my time poorly or, I'm just getting older. But the data we're looking at today suggests something entirely different.
Which is why today's deep dive is taking us into a really fascinating stack of structural analysis. We're looking at the week of April 27 to May 3, 2026. This is the MGF weekly report, specifically their 26W18 data.
And right up front, we really need to completely shift how we view current events for this one.
Yeah, we are absolutely not doing a standard news recap today. If you're looking for like a play-by-play of political polls or stock tickers, this isn't that. We are trying to understand the actual architecture of that exhaustion we just talked about.
Right. And the methodology in these sources uses an analytical framework called LMOS. That stands for Layered Macro Operational Systems.
Layered macro operational systems.
Right.
Okay.
And the easiest way to understand LMOS is that it really doesn't care about individual headlines. It looks at the globe as a series of interacting structural layers.
So it tracks things like shear, right, which
Yeah.
measures the velocity mismatch between different systems.
Exactly. Shear and also membrane tension. That basically maps the physical and economic friction happening right where those different global layers rub against each other.
So I want to establish the mission of this deep dive by compressing this entire week of really dense global analysis into a single, profound premise from the report. The authors summarized the state of the world with this one line: nothing is stopping, but nothing is getting lighter.
That line really sticks with you. I've spent a lot of time with this W18 data, and what stands out is the transition they're tracking. We're moving into what the researchers call a chronic high-load OS.
A chronic high-load OS, like a high-load operating system, but for civilization.
Yes, exactly. We're going to map out the growing phase gap between the ultra-high-speed systems of the world, like artificial intelligence and global finance, and the everyday low-speed living layers.
Which is where you, the listener, actually reside. So if you've been feeling that everyday discomfort, we're going to walk through the structural explanation behind it.
It's a really eye-opening framework.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the absolute fastest moving layer right now, which is artificial intelligence. For the last few years, I think most of us internalized AI as a software story. It was an app on your phone, a chatbot, a magical algorithm just floating frictionlessly in the cloud.
But the W18 data shows a massive phase shift. That software narrative has slammed headfirst into what the sources call the physical resource membrane.
The resource membrane. Wow.
Yeah, and the shift from a software narrative to a heavy infrastructure reality is just jarring when you look at the raw resource draw. The maintaining of this high-speed AI operating system is suddenly pulling massive, quantifiable physical resources from the local world.
Right, because the cloud is actually on the ground. We are talking about the cooling infrastructure required for localized data centers, which pulls heavily on municipal water supplies, right?
Exactly. We're looking at extreme power grid usage, an insatiable demand for raw construction labor just to build the facilities, and the heavy manufacturing of semiconductors.
And here is where we need to connect the dots on how that actually impacts the physical world. Let's introduce the only metaphor we are going to use today to visualize this.
It's a good one, too.
Think of AI not as an app floating in the cloud, but as a massive heat-generating engine installed right in the basement of your house. It is steadily drawing power and water away from the rest of the building.
Right, and the rest of the house is your everyday economy. The engine is down there doing incredible lightning-fast calculations, but you can literally feel the heat radiating through the floorboards.
Yeah. And you notice the water pressure dropping in your kitchen sink because that massive engine needs coolant. So exactly how does that heat transfer happen structurally?
Well, if a massive data center goes up in a rural county, the AI is updating in milliseconds. Right. But the physical world just doesn't move that fast.
It can't.
No. And that brings us to the concept of velocity mismatch. The AI layer operates at lightning speed, continuously updating and processing. But to maintain that speed, it relies entirely on low-speed physical realities.
Right, you cannot pour concrete or lay high-voltage power lines at the speed of software.
Exactly. Or purify water for cooling towers. So as the AI engine's demand increases, it pushes cost pressure outward. If a local utility has to upgrade its grid transmission lines to support, say, a 500-megawatt data center, the cost of that physical upgrade is eventually distributed.
Right, it doesn't just disappear. The local power market changes. The local water municipality has to alter its entire resource management.
Which means the story of AI has fundamentally shifted. It's no longer just a story of theoretical future growth.
According to this structural analysis, it is now a story of chronic maintenance costs. The high-speed system is actively extracting its operational costs from the low-speed physical world.
And this extraction isn't a one-time event either. That engine in the basement runs 247,
Always on.
always on. So the friction it creates on local resources becomes a permanent baseline. The local economy now has to operate around this massive, unyielding gravitational pull on its physical resources.
Okay, so let's follow that physical pull outward. Because if AI infrastructure, along with other high-speed global demands, is putting immense pressure on physical materials, copper, concrete, transformers, specialized cooling equipment.
Yeah, all of that heavy material has to be moved.
Exactly. That friction has to spill over into the systems that move those resources across the globe.
And the W18 sources provide a highly detailed look at this. They call it the Global Logistics and Energy Layer. Now, the traditional way to analyze this space is to look at isolated events.
Right. You read a headline about tensions in the Strait of Hormuz or, maneuvering by OPEC.
Or new international sanctions, or fluctuating maritime insurance rates, and you try to analyze each of those as a separate, distinct geopolitical crisis.
But the LMOS framework suggests that's actually the wrong way to look at it, right?
Yes, the key insight here is that global logistics have fundamentally transformed. They've moved from being a fixed, highly predictable system to a probabilistic one.
Probabilistic reality, that is such a crucial concept here.
It really is. For decades, global trade was essentially a fixed route. A shipping container leaves Shanghai, it arrives in Los Angeles in a set number of days for relatively predictable cost.
The variables were tight.
Very tight. But now, because of compounding geopolitical tensions and just the sheer weight of resource demand, the system no longer guarantees a straight line.
My initial instinct when I read about probabilistic shipping routes and huge insurance spikes is to assume the supply chain is on the verge of breaking completely.
Which is a totally natural reaction.
Yeah, we all have some trauma from recent years where the shelves were actually bare. So is this report pointing toward a global logistical collapse?
The sources emphasize repeatedly that this is not a collapse narrative. The logistics systems are not stopping. The ships are still moving. The oil is still flowing.
Nothing is stopping, but nothing is getting lighter.
Exactly. The core operational question has completely changed. It's no longer the binary question of, can the goods arrive or not? The new phase we've entered is, at what cost and with what delay can they still arrive?
So the system absorbs the shock by stretching rather than snapping. But how does that actually work in practice? Take maritime insurance, for example, which the report highlights.
Yeah, insurance is a perfect example. When a shipping route becomes unpredictable, say due to localized conflicts or sanctions, actuaries can no longer accurately model the risk of a single voyage.
So the insurance premiums become highly dynamic.
Exactly. A cargo ship might have to suddenly reroute around the Cape of Good Hope instead of using a canal. That adds weeks to the journey, it burns vastly more fuel, and incurs higher fluctuating insurance costs mid-voyage.
Wow.
The system doesn't break, but those added costs and sudden delays become structurally baked into the operating system.
The logistics layer is basically just a fluctuating probability field now. You don't know the final cost of moving a physical good until it actually arrives at the port.
Right, and those costs don't just vanish into thin air.
No, the shipping company doesn't just eat the cost of a 2-week delay and a tripled insurance premium out of the goodness of their hearts. That friction flows downstream.
It flows directly into what the structural models call the living layer.
Ah, the living layer. This is where we bring it all the way home to you, the listener. Because how does a probabilistic shipping lane or, a water usage dispute over an AI data center actually impact your Tuesday afternoon?
It's a great question. And the sources highlight a very specific type of price pressure happening in the living layer right now.
And we aren't talking about luxury electronics or high-end cars getting more expensive. The
Mhm.
friction is settling on basic recurring goods.
Yes. The report uses the example of natto,
Fermented soybeans.
right, which is an absolute staple everyday breakfast food in Japan. They also track the pricing of private brand or store brand items in supermarkets.
I actually noticed this myself recently. I was buying a basic carton of store brand eggs, and I actually stopped in the aisle and spent a full minute comparing the price per ounce with another brand. And I caught myself realizing that, like, a year ago, I would have just tossed the store brand into the cart without breaking stride. When the price of the absolute basics starts shifting unpredictably, the burden fundamentally changes.
That pause in the grocery aisle is the exact mechanism the W18 report is measuring.
Really?
Yeah. When the price of a high-end television goes up, you can simply choose to delay that purchase. It is a discrete, one-time financial decision.
Sure.
But when the price of basic recurring goods goes up, the things you rely on just to sustain your baseline existence, the burden stops being purely financial. It becomes a cognitive burden.
Cognitive fatigue, that's the real metric here.
Yeah.
Because every time there is a small price hike on the absolute basics, it forces the consumer to perform a micro recalculation.
Yes.
You are standing in the aisle thinking, should I change the weekly menu? Do I need to start shopping at a different store entirely? Can I still afford to buy this exact brand every week? Or do I need to downgrade my preferences?
And it's those relentless micro recalculations that generate the wear and tear. You're taking active decision-making energy and applying it to routines that used to be fully automatic.
Wow.
In the structural models, this is described as a loss of recovery margin or a drop in resynchronization capacity.
That framing makes so much sense. Recovery margin. The friction from the high-speed AI layer and the probabilistic logistics layer is actively altering the ambient conditions of your daily life.
It's all connected.
And it's silently eating into the mental energy you normally reserve to rest, to connect with your family, to recover from the workday. You're constantly adapting to chronic load conditions.
The adaptation is key here because, again, this isn't a dramatic explosion of hyperinflation where society grinds to a halt. It's a silent, accumulating wear and tear.
Right.
It is the small, daily acts of giving up a tiny bit of convenience, a tiny bit of preference week after week.
Yeah.
The massive structural friction of the global OS is ultimately absorbed locally by individuals in the form of cognitive fatigue.
Okay, I want to push back on this a little, though, or at least play devil's advocate using the broader narrative we hear in the media.
Sure. Go ahead.
If daily life is becoming this cognitively exhausting and everyone in the living layer feels this loss of recovery margin, why are the official economic reports largely painting a picture of stability? I look at the jobs reports, the consumer spending numbers. The institutions are telling us the economy is holding strong.
Right. It looks great on paper.
Yeah. So are they just ignoring the data? Or is there a genuine disconnect?
The W18 analysis tackles this directly by introducing the concept of the institutional phase gap.
The institutional phase gap.
Yes. The institutions operating the high-speed global OS, central banks, massive financial institutions, government treasuries, they are not necessarily ignoring the data maliciously. The problem is that they're using a legacy vocabulary.
Oh, interesting.
They look at the world through quantifiable macroeconomic metrics. The consumer price index, unemployment numbers, gross domestic product.
And through that specific high-level lens, the system looks completely fine. People are employed, goods are eventually arriving despite the delays, and consumers are technically still spending money.
Exactly. The institutions measure the transaction itself. But the living layer, your daily reality, is dealing with low visibility variables that those institutions simply do not have the instruments to measure.
Because how does a central bank quantify your cognitive fatigue?
They can't.
How does an economic report measure the loss of your weekend recovery time because you had to take on a side gig, or, the mental toll of recalculating your grocery budget every single week?
They don't. They measure that you bought the eggs. They don't measure the minute you stood in the aisle stressing about which eggs to buy.
Wow. So a massive gap opens up between the official narrative and the lived reality. It's like a silent structural fault line. The institutional operating system is highly synchronized with financial velocity, but it is completely out of sync with the human need for rest.
That's perfectly said.
Which leads to a really uncomfortable realization. The institutions say we are stable, while the living layer is silently degrading. But if the logistics haven't snapped and the AI keeps expanding, what is the actual threat here?
The real threat modeled in the data is adaptation.
adaptation.
Yes.
Yeah.
The danger is that this state of chronic high friction simply becomes permanently normalized. The high-speed layers, the AI engines demanding power, the highly optimized supply chains routing around global conflicts, they refuse to internalize the low-speed living layers' need for recovery.
They treat human rest or even just the desire for a predictable, low-stress routine as an inefficiency that needs to be optimized away.
Yes.
The system just expects you to absorb the heat from that engine in the basement forever and adapt to the rising temperature.
And that is the definition of a chronic high-load OS. It is a civilization where the baseline standard is a continuous, low-grade grind. The institutions lack the sensors to even acknowledge the friction is happening, because as long as the transaction's clear, the system registers as healthy.
Man, we have covered some profound ground today. We started by taking that vague feeling of exhaustion and giving it a structural architecture.
We did.
We traced the invisible friction starting from the physical, heavy demands of new AI infrastructure, the water, the power, the concrete.
Yep.
We watched that demand spill over into global logistics, turning predictable shipping routes into probabilistic, fluctuating fields of cost and delay. We followed those costs right down to the living layer, tracking how they manifest as cognitive fatigue and a loss of recovery margin when you're literally just trying to buy basic recurring goods.
Which is wild to think about.
And finally, we looked at the institutional phase gap, exploring why the people steering the economy lack the vocabulary to even measure the toll this takes on you.
And the primary takeaway from the MGF W18 report is that we need to stop waiting for a singular collapse.
Right.
Or, conversely, a return to the frictionless normal of the past. We're looking at a permanent transition into a new operating system for civilization. Constant friction is simply the new baseline.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? You now have the structural reality behind that atmospheric pressure you've been feeling, but it leaves us with a massive unresolved tension to ponder on your own.
It really does.
In a world optimized entirely for high-speed operation and continuous load, what happens to our inherent human capacity to recover? If our global systems view our need to disconnect, recharge, and simply exist without recalculation as a bug rather than a feature, how long can the living layer sustain this chronic load before individual resilience permanently snaps?
The structural models can track the friction, but they cannot predict the limits of human endurance. That is the variable still left blank.
Something to think about next time you're standing in the grocery aisle, making those micro recalculations and feeling the heat from the engine in the basement.